afternoon. Today we're going to talk about poverty and aid. My name is Catherine and joining me is my friend Bethany. Hello Bethany.
Hello.
So we're going to discuss poverty all around the world, and in particular we're going to discuss the methods of alleviating poverty. It's an area of study that has been debated for decades, and everyone has a different opinion on how we should go about changing it. The most important thing to understand about the issue is that there's no one single cause of poverty, and so there's no one solution either. Poverty is an incredibly complex issue, and that's why most aid programs fail to deliver their desirable results. But to begin with, let's ask ourselves what poverty actually is. We're all familiar with images like this one. They're displayed on TV, in flyers and posters, and they're all over the internet. Pictures of starving children are designed to ignite compassion in affluent people and inspire action. Poverty refers to whether a person or a family has enough resources or abilities to meet their basic needs for survival. These needs include, but aren't limited to, clothing, food, shelter, freedom, clean water, healthcare, etc. Poverty is measured by the basic needs poverty line, which means living on less than $1.25 US per person per day. Poverty might include a child drinking dirty water and getting sick, a mother dying in childbirth because she didn't have a doctor, a grandfather too weak to move from not having enough to eat. These are extreme forms of poverty, but there are other forms as well. Children not able or allowed to attend school, adults going through their entire lives being illiterate, families living in dirty squatter slums, and people being jailed for their religious beliefs are other forms of poverty. But these are all examples of assaults on human rights, which we're all entitled to. The trouble is that these things occur simultaneously all across the world for a myriad of different reasons. So now that we understand what poverty is and just how big of an issue it is, let's move on to discuss aid. So, what is aid? Humanitarian aid is by far the most common way to combat poverty, and there are literally thousands of organisations in the world today. We're all familiar with their message, so let's play a game to see how much we already know about aid and how much we can learn. So these are some logos of some prominent aid organisations today. Can you have a guess at which companies belong to which logos, Bethany?
Okay, I think the yellow one is Amnesty International.
That's right.
The orange one next to it is World Vision.
That's right.
The blue one at the top is, I think, the World Bank.
Meh.
And the green one I think is Oxfam.
That's right.
I don't know about the others.
So the red two. One with the little man, this one, that's Doctors Without Borders. Fabulous organisation. This one over here isn't actually the World Bank, that's the United Nations. And the one at the bottom with the eye is the Fred Hollows Foundation.
Right.
So, now that we are more familiar with them, let's discuss them more specifically. These are all examples of agencies which are called not-for-profit, non-government organisations. They rely on donations from individuals and companies as well as government grants in order to operate. Oxfam and World Vision, for example, are broad spectrum agencies. They're concerned with providing money so that families can have clean water, food, healthcare, all those kind of things. But the Fred Hollows Foundation and Doctors Without Borders are more specifically concerned with healthcare to impoverished people. So now that we're familiar with these organisations, let's discuss how aid is given to developing countries. Hold on. Okay, so the first way, which we've just discussed, is NGOs. After that, bilateral aid is also a very common way. Specifically, it's a government-to transfer of money. For example, the government of Australia giving money directly to the government of Afghanistan to improve poverty. And multilateral aid refers to a donor country giving aid to an international organisation, and the aid is then given from the organisation to the country. For example, Australia could give the World Bank money and then they would send it on to Afghanistan after that. So, why is aid given? The primary reason for the giving of aid is simply that we want to help other human beings. It's a moral responsibility to end conflict and human suffering, and there's heaps of it in the world today, so it's a really important area. So, just to give you an example, 280 million people in sub-Saharan Africa are living in conditions of extreme poverty, and that's today. The healthcare of the people in this area is also devastating. There are 34 million people in the world today that live with HIV/AIDS, and 2/3 of them come from sub-Saharan Africa. And unfortunately, the issue of HIV goes much deeper than just poor health. The rural majorities of Africa rely on physical labour to provide food and water for their families. Debilitating illnesses like HIV makes providing these essential things impossible because adults are simply too unwell to collect water for their children. In this case, children are born into poverty and never have a chance of getting out. And this is the sad truth of poverty around the world today. It's a vicious cycle that repeats itself through generations. And in other parts of the world, healthcare is a major issue affecting poverty. Sorry, that's a cat. In southern Asia, 250 million people are undernourished. Asia also has the additional problem of overpopulation. Stop laughing, Pep. 35% of people in South Asia live in squatter settlements on the outskirts of major cities. These settlements do not have running water or any kind of sanitation. The problem here is that large amounts of people live closely together, and this spreads infectious diseases much more quickly than it otherwise would. And again, we see the cycle of poverty. Poor health to begin with, followed by no sanitation, and coupled with high population density. And then, of course, there isn't a way to treat sick people because these countries lack healthcare facilities, and there just isn't the money required to pay for the treatments. Mm-hmm. Another reason to give aid is to end conflict. Sadly, conflict and poverty come hand in hand. People can't be indefinitely sick and hungry without eventually reacting to it. Africa has seen many incidences of civil war breaking out because of terrible living conditions and governments not doing enough or really doing anything to help. So to provide aid also creates a peaceful environment for people to eventually prosper. Let's move on. Okay, so where does aid go? This is a map of the world, and the redder it is, the more money is sent in there. And obviously as the colours get cooler, the less money that's sent. So you can see very developed countries like Australia, for example, over here receives almost no aid.
Nothing.
No, obviously there are internal organisations, but nothing on this scale. America, like modern America, up here Northern America, nothing. Canada the same. Down here Latin America a little bit. There's overpopulation issues there definitely, but you can see that the vast majority of the world's aid gets funneled into Asia and especially into Africa. Lots of reasons for it. Traditional ones, these economies generally perform pretty badly, particularly Africa. Africa's also got climate things on top of it. It's very hot, it's very dry, there's very little rainfall, it's hard to grow things, there's no water. It perpetuates the problem, all that sort of thing. So that's just a brief idea for you. So, the benefits of aid. What has it actually done? What has it achieved? In 1990, the Millennium Goals, which we're all very familiar with, were drawn up, and the idea was basically to make the situation of poverty a lot better than what it was at the time. So in terms of the progress that has been made and things that have been achieved, the amount of people living on less than $1.25 a day has halved. In 1990, the global population of those in extreme poverty was 47%, and in 2010 it had been halved to 22%, so that's an incredible increase. No, decrease, I should say, yeah. Combating HIV, AIDS, malaria and other diseases has also been improved. Between 2000 and 2010, mortality rates from malaria fell by 25% globally. So the progress is slow, but it is there definitely. But of course, when we talk about the positives of something, there are negatives that go hand in hand with it. Mm-hmm. So let's discuss the disadvantages of aid. The wasting of money when it comes to aid is widespread and very sad, and it's pretty hard to say that something's just wasted, but if it's not achieving its purpose, if the money was given and it doesn't fulfill what it was supposed to, then it is a waste of sorts. So just as an example, between 1960 and 2010, $4.6 trillion were given in official development assistance in that 50-year period, and official development assistance doesn't actually cover all forms of aid, it just covers the official stuff, it doesn't include the NGOs. So with so much money spent, 3 billion people, which is half the world's population, still lives in poverty of one form or another. So the problem's astronomical. And all this money hasn't actually really done all that much. It's a really, really sobering thought. So let's discuss some of the specific disadvantages. Debt is probably one of the most crippling ones. And it is the trouble with bilateral aid. And it's because bilateral aid is usually given in the form of a loan. So when a donor country gives money, it's expected to be repaid. It works in much the same way as if you go out and get a loan for your house. You're given the money, but you have to repay it, and you have to repay it with interest. And this is the sad truth of the modern world. There is no such thing as a free lunch. For example, in Africa, by the beginning of the 1990s, debt to donor countries was at least $1 trillion US, and the cost of servicing these debts, or more accurately, the interest accruing on them, was colossal. Eventually, the cost of debt surpassed the amount of money still coming in via humanitarian aid. So, what it means is that there was more money going out to the repayment of debt than what there was coming back in, and the cycle obviously repeats itself, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and before you know it, we've got a catastrophe on our hands. It makes economies perform literally in reverse, and in terms of development, it's absurd. But it happens, and it has happened, and it's really sad. And that, of course, brings me to the motivation for the giving of said bilateral aid. These countries like, us and America and whoever else that give large sums of money to impoverished countries, they're not just doing it out of the kindness of their hearts. As sad as that is, they do it because they actually earn interest on it in the long run. They make money out of it. But it also goes deeper than that, because another ulterior motive of donation is that developed countries earn themselves powerful bargaining chips with poor countries. For example, if I give this country money, then they're going to owe me a favour. And that happens all the time. Developed countries are burdened with unpayable debts, and then they present as easy targets. So a big country that's been donating might require an overseas military base, they might want UN votes, they might want access to oil, any of these things, and if a poor country owes them billions of dollars, they're probably going to say yes. So it puts countries in a position where they're completely at the mercy of the donor's will. And it also increases dependency, and some countries are entirely dependent on aid. For example, the government of Nepal, their economic budget is made up of 60% humanitarian aid, which makes it their most important revenue stream. Nepal is, like many poor countries, entirely dependent on aid coming in, which brings me to poor economics, and the two really go hand in hand. Aid-dependent countries tend to make very poor economic choices and policies. Humanitarian aid can be ineffective because poor countries are often tempted to spend on consumption rather than investment. Do you know what I mean by consumption?
No.
Okay, so consumption is food, or it's water, or it's shelter, or it's clothing, and you would think that that's a pretty reasonable thing. If you have thousands of starving people, you buy them food. But that's actually very, very bad in the long run, because it's a quick fix for a very embedded problem.
It doesn't last, you have to keep buying it.
That's right, yeah. And it just repeats over and over and over again, and the debt gets bigger and bigger and bigger because they have to keep borrowing money to buy more food, and it's not sustainable. That's the problem. Spending on consumption instead of infrastructure, which would be putting people to work and letting them earn their own money, is the way forward. So this presents the vicious cycle of consumption and debt. Aid is usually given according to need. So the concern of a developing country in terms of making better choices is that if they perform better, the aid might cease or lessen because they just don't need it anymore. This kind of economic principle is very backwards, and it brings us to perhaps the most significant criticism levelled at humanitarian aid, which is corruption. Data that indicates actual levels of corruption is pretty scarce, which is hardly surprising because it's not like anybody would publish it. You're not going to ring up the Sydney Morning Herald and say, guess what, I'm corrupt. But lots of accusations exist, and there's definitely some foundation in them. For example, in 2004, the British envoy to Kenya, his name was Sir Edward Clay, complained loudly to the global media about rampant corruption, commenting that Kenya's ministers were eating like gluttons and voting on the shoes of foreign donors. That's a direct quote. In 2005, after he was prodded by Kenyan and British officials to make a public apology for his remarks, he did apologise. He said that he was sorry for the moderation of his language, for underestimating the scale of the looting, and for failing to speak out earlier. Good bloke, I would have thought. Clay's observations, while courageous, certainly weren't unprecedented. According to the organisation Transparency International, the former Nigerian president Sani Abacha, I hope I said that right, is estimated to have stolen $5 billion in aid and moved it into Swiss private banks. He was arrested and some of the money was returned, but definitely not all of it. So he's just one example, but what of the hundreds of these characters who aren't caught, who get away with it and whose wives have gold jewelleries and drive around in Porsches? Corruption of this kind is the most significant waste of aid, and 4.6 trillion in development assistance is all well and good, but it's useless if all it does is to line the pockets of corrupt warlords. Moving on. So perhaps a less explored idea about the failures of aid is the use of celebrities to champion the cause. You'd think it'd be a good thing, but let's watch a short clip and we'll see what we think. Sorry, just bear with me. Where did we put it? Is that it? Oh yes, here we go.
Global citizens, please welcome Professor Jeffrey Sachs, Special Advisor to the UN on the Millennium Development Goals, with actress and activist Olivia Wilde.
Share this.
Amazing! Imagine if your mother or brother or child were very sick. What would you do? You drive them to the doctor or to a nearby clinic. But in some parts of the developing world, especially for those living in rural sub-Saharan Africa, your only choice would be to go on foot. Mothers often carry a sick child 5 or 10 miles, and they often arrive too late to the clinic.
That's why I am so proud to support Jeffrey Sachs and the campaign for 1 million community health workers. Its goal is to train individuals from the communities themselves to provide health care to the people of sub-Saharan rural Africa. Let's give a hand for the telecommunications and pharmaceutical companies who are making this campaign possible.
Okay, will do.
I'm really excited to announce that you made it possible.
I don't want to Jeffrey Sachs, he's a good bloke, but... Okay. Oops. Alright, technical difficulties, people, bear with me. Aha! Oh, bugger. Right. Now, what do we think?
I think from the clip, you can see, I don't see the point of having a celebrity there when she doesn't know anything about it. I'd prefer to see an expert telling, or not an expert, but someone who's really involved in, development telling me and getting me excited about it, whereas I just don't really see the point of having her there. And she was reading off the screen.
She was.
She didn't even know what she was talking about.
She tripped over her words a little bit.
Yeah.
It's a bit cringy, and the nice little plug about the pharmaceutical companies
Yeah,
at
and
the end
the
was a bit
pharmaceutical companies
tasteless.
is ridiculous.
Yeah, it's... You would think it'd be a good thing, but I think it really derails the issue. The famous singer Bono from U2 wrote recently, and I'll just read this to you. History will be our judge, but what is written about is up to us. We can't say our generation didn't know how to do it. We can't say our generation couldn't afford it. It's all up to us. This is really utopian dialogue, and it's all warm and fuzzy and nice, but it actually transforms aid into a commodity of popular culture that really subverts attention from the actual issue. And what I mean by that is, Angelina Jolie here on the screen, she's cuddling a very, very sick child, which is all nice and everything, but society is generally so bedazzled by Angelina Jolie or by Olivia Wilde or Bono or whoever that they don't pay appropriate attention to the actual issue. So in my opinion, it makes aid more useless than it would be otherwise. Yeah, that's right. Because they just throw money at the problem. So let me give you an example of how celebrity involvement doesn't actually help. There's a mosquito net maker in Africa. He manufactures 500 nets a week. He employs 10 people, each who have upwards of 15 relatives. However hard they work, they can't make enough nets to combat the malaria-carrying mosquito. Enter enthusiastic Hollywood movie star who rallies the masses and provokes Western governments to collect and send 100,000 mosquito nets to the affected region. The nets arrive and are distributed and the good deed is done. But with the market flooded with free mosquito nets, the maker is suddenly out of business. His 10 workers can no longer support their 150 dependents, and those people either rely on handouts or starve. This kind of generosity actually undermines whatever fragile chance for sustainable development is already in play. So, what I mean by this is, if we chuck heaps and heaps of money at it, it's only good for as long as the mosquito nets last, and by the way, they tend not to because they're not manufactured the same way and they're not used for the right purposes and all this messy stuff goes on. But it destroys small business, and this is just one example, and it does happen in all forms of small business which begin to come together to start the beginnings of an economy, and the whole thing sort of malfunctions and doesn't work, and it actually pushes people back into poverty. And I know it sounds a bit bizarre to get your head around it, that the giving of aid and that the giving of resources actually makes the problem worse, but in the long run it actually does, because
It takes away people's jobs.
yeah, that's right, and then they can't support themselves and they have to rely on aid, and it's more dependence, and there is definitely not enough money for it, so not everybody gets it and people die, and it's horrible. So let's move on to the final possible solution for this, which is no aid at all. It's definitely a more controversial solution, but many scholars of development argue that previously impoverished countries have seen widespread development and improvement in living standards over the past few decades, and that it didn't have anything to do with aid, but rather with sound economic principles. China's a good example of this, and as we discussed earlier, aid increases dependency and it increases debt, it encourages poor economics and also corruption, and it undermines the chance of internal development. So perhaps the only way to ensure good economic policies is to force governments to make long-term choices, and to do that we have to turn the tap off entirely. Using China as the example, they haven't been a recipient of aid for decades. Instead, they concentrated on industry and trade, and it worked. China's development is unprecedented, and it's lifted millions of the Chinese from poverty. It's a pretty radical step, but what do you think would happen if we removed aid altogether and let everybody fend for themselves?
I think when you first removed all aid, a lot of people would be in like extreme poverty. I think a lot of people would probably die. But in the long run, and civil war and maybe even international war could possibly break out. But in the long run, it could force these pretty corrupt countries to reform and put in place better policies and better economics. But I don't know who's willing to risk the lives of some to save the many.
Yeah, and that's the major question, and there isn't an answer to it. And until we try it, there just isn't an answer. But I think the backlash is just unthinkable. I think there'd be twice the famine that there is now, and there'd definitely be civil war left, right, and centre. And 'cause you can't just strip people of the tiny little ray of hope that they have. But that said, the current system doesn't work either. So,
but also I think some of the reason that we do give aid is because like Africa was colonised by a lot of different people, so the countries that colonise them feel some responsibility.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, and even those that weren't colonised, I think that most decent human beings definitely just want to help. They feel a moral responsibility because we're all the same really at the end of the day. But again, it's the issue. It's too complex. It's too big. It all happens at once for a million different reasons in a million different places, and it's just really, really hard to get a handle on it. So I suppose that the only way is to keep trudging along the way that we are, and as we said earlier, we're definitely making some improvements. But whatever we do, we have to keep, I think, doing something, because poverty is probably the worst form of violence that there is. So all of you out there, be concerned with poverty and donate to aid unless you're worried that it'll turn out to go into the hands of corrupt warlords, which I'm worried about personally, but we'll see how it goes. Thank you. Yay.